Welcome aboard the Strange Express. My name is Dr. Scherzo Stantio. Today's story is once again based on an old fairy tale. The original story was called Pudocky, and it was the story of a girl named Parsley. Parsley, we are told, was so named because of her appetite for the green herb. You know, that green twig that sits on your plate and you don't know whether you're supposed to eat it or stick it in your lapel. Apparently, she couldn't get enough of the stuff. We've altered the story somewhat to give it a little different flavor. And trust me, dear viewer, these changes have not been made to appease the modern audience, but rather to satisfy our own sick sense of humor. So, in our story, her name is no longer Parsley, but rather Garlic. As usual, please find a seat and make yourself comfortable, as I believe I just heard the engineer give the signal that we're about to be on our way.
Once upon a time, in a galaxy not too far from the one where you are now, there was a poor woman who had one little daughter who was known as Garlic. She had earned this name because of her strange craving for the odoriferous allium. Garlic was her favorite food, and she seldom ate anything else. Unfortunately, the potentate of this galaxy not too far from where you are now, was a very bad ruler, and due to his disastrous economic policies, all food, including garlic, had become a luxury item, and the woman found it more and more difficult to purchase the object of her daughter's gastronomical craving. Now Garlic was a very beautiful girl, so beautiful that it was said that one look at her would truly take your breath away. Opinions vary, though, and others indicated that it was not her beauty that took your breath away, but be that as it may, all agreed that Garlic was indeed a very beautiful girl. As a result of her love for her beautiful daughter, the woman was willing to do whatever she needed to do to sate her peculiar appetite. As it happened, a strange old woman lived in the vicinity that grew lots of garlic. Many believed the old woman to be a witch, but anyone that accused her would mysteriously disappear, so most people said that she was simply an eccentric senior citizen. When asked why she grew so much garlic, the old woman would cackle and answer that she was trying to build up her immunity. Besides, it kept the vampires away. No one had the heart, or more likely, nerve, to tell her that it kept everyone away. So, armed with the knowledge that the old woman grew so much garlic, the mother would sneak into the old woman's garden each night and steal a dozen or so bulbs to satisfy her daughter's appetite. The renown of the young girl's odd taste had reached far and wide, and it wasn't long before the old woman figured out who was stealing her garlic. She summoned the girl's mother and proposed that she allow her daughter to come and live with her and become her apprentice, and that way she could gorge herself with garlic to her heart's content. Now Garlic's mother was not too keen on the idea, as the old woman had a very bad reputation as an evil and vile person, and she was afraid of what the old woman might do to her daughter, but she was also afraid that if she did not agree that she and Garlic might get disappeared. Seeing her hesitancy, the old old woman reassured her that nothing untoward would happen to her daughter. Besides, the old woman claimed that she was familiar with Garlic's eating disorder. With that, the old woman introduced herself. Her name was Celery Hinton. After several more reassurances from the old woman, Garlic's mother finally agreed to allow Garlic to go live with the old woman. Meanwhile, in a nearby kingdom, there was a king that had 3 sons. Believing that travel broadens the mind, and also noting that his sons were getting broad in the seat, the king sent his sons out into the world to gain experience. This was coupled with the fact that the boys were constantly fighting and bickering among themselves, and the king craved some peace and quiet. Eventually the trio came to the town where Garlic lived, and while admiring the old woman's garden, they caught a glimpse of Garlic through a window as she sat brushing her long hair. Immediately Immediately, all three of them fell in love with her, and each one pledged to try to make her his wife. As they all three did this at the same time, a quarrel broke out between the three brothers, and they drew their swords and began fighting each other and shouting things at each other, which I cannot relay in this family-friendly video. In fact, the commotion was so intense that it drew the attention of the old woman, and she immediately knew that the princes were fighting about Garlic. Now Garlic had lived with the old woman for some time at this point, and due to Garlic's sweet nature and kindness, as well as the general atmosphere that she lent to her home, the old woman had taken a strong dislike to her. Unfortunately, the loud quarreling of the princes just outside her home was the final straw for the old woman, and she fell into a rage and put a curse on Garlic, turning her into a toad, and banished her to a dark and gloomy place, and Garlic found herself sitting all alone under a bridge. When the three princes saw what the old woman had done, and that Garlic had disappeared, they were afraid and forgot their quarrel, and made up and quickly returned to their father's kingdom. Now their father was getting very old, and wanted to turn over the running of the kingdom to one of his sons. He loved all three equally, but he knew that each had their shortcomings, and he wanted to devise a way that they could compete, and the winner would become his successor. So he met with his three sons and explained that he planned to retire and place the management of the kingdom into one of their hands. The one that would become his successor would need to prove that he was the most clever and resourceful by completing 3 difficult tasks better than the other 2. The old king then revealed that the first task was to bring him a piece of linen that had to be 100 yards long, but it had to be so fine that it could completely pass through his gold ring. The 3 princes bowed before the king and pledged to do their best, and immediately left on their quest for the linen. The 2 older brothers rode in fine carriages, while the younger brother chose to travel by foot. As the brothers began their journey together, they discussed their mission as they went, pondering if such a material even existed. "If not," said the oldest brother, "perhaps it can be fabricated." The middle brother replied, "You and your lies." Soon they came to a fork in the road. Since that last corny joke, management has cautioned me against making another corny joke so soon, so I will spare everyone the mandatory fork in the road joke. There were 3 roads to choose from. The roads on the left and right were wide and appeared to be frequently traveled, while the road in the middle was narrow and was hardly more than a foot trail, and it appeared dark and foreboding. The 2 older brothers, in their carriages, took the wider roads that appeared to be more traveled, while the younger brother, bidding his older brothers farewell, started walking down the dark and foreboding middle road. The older brothers traveled to cities and purchased bales of finest linen, until their carriages were filled to the top with the stuff, and then they started back home, feeling confident that at least one of the bales that they bought would meet their father's requirements. The youngest brother traveled down the dark and foreboding footpath for many days. Soon, the sad atmosphere of the dismal land began to dampen the young man's usually upbeat spirit. One morning, after traveling many miles, he came to a small bridge that was over a murky stream that flowed through the flat marshy land. The only feature of the land was that it seemed to be the most dismal place in the world. By this time, the young prince was so discouraged that he went down to the edge of the stream and sat on a rock, to contemplate whether he should give up the quest and return home, or just keep traveling, and make a new start and forget the quest. As he sat there, feeling like he was a failure, a solitary tear began to trickle down his cheek, when suddenly he heard a kind, cheerful voice greet him, saying,
"Morning glory."
The prince looked around, but he didn't see who had spoke to him. Wiping away the tear with his shirt sleeve, the prince responded, in keeping with the floral vein,
"Hi, Biscus."
The prince heard the sound of a small laugh, or rather, a giggle, as he continued to look for the source of the greeting. The kind voice spoke again.
"What brings you to my little corner of the world, sunshine?"
At this point, the prince was sure that the voice was emanating from a misshapen toad that had crawled out of the swamp and sat down next to him. This surprised the prince, as he had never seen a toad that was misshapen before. Seeing that the prince seemed to be startled, the toad repeated its question.
"So what brings you to my neck of the swamp, tall, dark, and poorly illustrated?"
The prince contemplated a moment whether he should respond to the amphibian, and finally answered,
"What would be the point in it, Toady?"
The toad looked sincerely at the prince and answered,
"Perhaps I can help you."
The prince seemed annoyed at this and answered,
"Why? Are you supposed to be some kind of wise old toad?" If I was looking for advice from a woodland creature, shouldn't I seek out an owl?
Something like a smile crossed the face of the toad, and the toad answered,
I don't know, I personally don't trust those owls. They seem to know the who alright, but they don't seem to know squat about the when, what, or where. I had a friend, who was a mouse, and she was having some personal problems and she went to an owl for advice. It didn't work out so well for her. She had an annoying squeaky voice, but I still miss her. Not only that, but I once knew a guy that went to an owl with his lollipop.
Alright already.
the prince answered.
I'll tell you.
The prince then bent down and confidentially related the reason for his quest to the toad. After he had finished, the toad looked up to him and said,
You're right. I can't help you. That's a first world problem, and I don't have any experience dealing with those out here in the swamp.
The prince was immediately crestfallen. As soon as the toad noticed the prince's sad demeanor, she said,
Just kidding, kiddo. I've got just what you need. Wait here just a minute.
With that, she crawled back into the swamp, and after about a minute, she came back, dragging a grayish piece of linen that appeared to be no more than 3 inches long. The prince looked at the little piece of linen, and then he looked at the toad. The toad looked back at the prince with such sincerity that the prince did not have the heart to tell her that she obviously missed the part about the length requirement. The toad then said to the prince,
Take this to your father, you'll see.
Not wanting to hurt the toad's feelings, the prince picked up the little piece of linen and put it in his pocket. The toad then added,
Now take care of that and don't lose it. I had to break a set for that one. I figured it would be better than the fitted sheet.
The prince thanked the toad, and headed back to his father's kingdom. The toad watched the prince until he disappeared over the horizon, and then she crept back into her swamp. We pause now for a word from one of our non-sponsors.
Weather shows!
That was not the word.
Try the latest smell sensation for everybody from your overlords at Weird Evil Fragrances. We call it New World Odor. Like all of our products, it is unisex and is true to our top-down philosophy of one size fits all. You will wear it and be happy. New World Odor is exclusively manufactured in the laboratories here at Weird Evil Fragrances from the entrails of grubs, spiders, and an occasional stink bug. It smells so good that you'll want to eat it, but don't do so. You won't want to waste a single drop. Rub some in your children's hair and watch while dirty old men randomly approach them to get a sniff. Don't use your common sense. Use New World Odor, an uncommon scent. It's the fragrance that some say smells just like your cat's breath first thing in the morning. Others go further, saying, it truly smells of death. New World Odor. It will have you too saying New World Odor reeks to high heaven.
This uncommercial was brought to you by the Strange Express. Subscribe to our channel and take a ride to the weird and wonderful.
Now, back to our story. As the prince traveled homeward, he noticed that the linen seemed to be getting heavier in his pocket. As the linen grew heavier, he found that his heart grew lighter. As he continued on his journey, the bundle continued to grow heavier, and the prince thought to himself that while the tiny piece of linen might not make much of a bed sheet, it certainly made a good comforter. The young prince smiled as he thought that was very humorous. When he arrived home, he found that his brothers had already arrived, and they teased him about being the last one to return, and they also taunted him for returning without a large bundle of linen. The young prince didn't tell them about the small piece of linen that was now weighing quite heavily in his pocket. Before long, they went in to meet with their father, who was very happy to see them. The king then took a ring from his finger and began testing all the linen that the princes had brought back in their carriages, but none of them were able to pass completely through the ring. Finally, the king looked to his youngest son and asked if he had returned with any linen. The young prince reached into his pocket and to his surprise the small dirty piece of linen that he had expected to find had somehow been transformed into an entire bale of clean linen that appeared to be of the highest quality and unsurpassed color. The old king pulled it through the ring and it passed through without any difficulty. He then had the linen measured to make sure that it was 100 yards, and it was exactly 100 yards. The old king turned and hugged his youngest son and congratulated him on fulfilling the first quest. After presenting his 2 older sons with certificates of participation, he then announced to the entire court assembled that his youngest son had successfully completed the first quest, but there were 2 more tasks that had to be fulfilled before the final winner would be determined. The second quest would be to bring back a dog that would fit comfortably into a walnut shell. None of the sons were excited about this task, as it seemed that their father was requesting the impossible, but as they all wanted to win the crown, they resigned themselves to do the best that they could, and after resting a couple of weeks from their travels, all 3 set out again seeking the microdog. Upon reaching the crossroads, the brothers separated once more.
Make my day.
The youngest prince went down the dark and foreboding footpath once again. He hadn't traveled far when a feeling of utter depression fell upon him. He began to think,
Will Toady be able to help me this time? What if I can't find Toady? What if Toady has been eaten by that mean old owl?
At this point I reassured the young prince that I was certain that everything would turn out all right. He calmed down immediately. Well, almost immediately. It seems he was not aware of my presence, and when I spoke to him, it apparently frightened him so severely that he had to make a trip into the woods to see a man about a bear, if you know what I mean. You see what I did there. The usual phrase is see a man about a dog, but as the young prince was actually seeking a dog, I was afraid that using the original phrase might confuse the issue. Besides, switching the animal to a bear in the woods more accurately reflects the reason for his trip into the woods, but I digress. Anyway, upon returning from his little side trip, he wanted to know who I was, and how I knew what he was thinking, and why I seemed so sure that things would turn out all right. I told him that I was a storyteller, and I certainly wouldn't be here wasting my time if things weren't going to turn out all right. Apparently he was not fully convinced, as he seemed to think that storyteller was simply a euphemism for liar. I assured him that the euphemism for liar is actually mainstream network news personality, but this only seemed to confuse him more, as he was unfamiliar with the term. The young prince then continued down the footpath for days until once again he came to the bridge. Surveying the area, he did not see Toady anywhere, so once more he went down to the edge of the stream and sat down on a rock and began to mope. It wasn't long before he was cheered up when he heard the friendly voice of Toady. She called out to the prince,
You really shouldn't sit on that wet rock.
The prince smiled and answered,
Silly Toady, it's not true. You know, the old saying about it causing piles.
The toad answered,
I wouldn't know about that, but I know that there's a stray dog that wanders through here from time to time, and he thinks that rock is his personal urinal.
The young prince stood up and touched the back of his pants and grimaced and then wiped his fingers on the trunk of a nearby tree.
So what brings you back to Happy Acres, home of the golden sunshine and showers?
The toad asked. Remembering his mission, the prince asked,
How big is this dog with a bladder control problem?
The toad looked cockeyed at the prince and answered,
About the size of a small horse, and control is not his problem, but his aim's not so hot. Why do you ask?
It's this new task my father has given me.
The prince answered,
I have to find a dog that is small enough to fit comfortably inside a walnut shell.
The toad's expression appeared to change and she said,
Why didn't you say so? I think I have just what you need.
With that, she crawled away and went back into the swamp. After a few minutes, she returned, dragging a hazelnut behind her. She placed the hazelnut on the prince's shoe and said,
There you go.
The prince, a bit confused, looked down at the hazelnut on his shoe, and then at the toad, and then he said,
I don't get it. What am I supposed to do with that?
The toad answered,
It's for your father.
The young prince, still looking confused, asked,
What am I supposed to do with it? Hand it to him and say, Here, Dad, nuts to you.
Don't be silly.
The toad answered,
There's only one nut there. You give it to your father and tell him to crack it open very carefully, and then watch what happens.
The prince reached down and picked up the hazelnut and put it in his pocket. The moment that he touched the hazelnut, he immediately felt reassured, and thanked the toad profusely, and bid her goodbye and headed back home, and the toad watched the prince leave until he had disappeared from sight, and then she crept back into the swamp. Time now for another non-commercial from another non-sponsor.
Hi folks, this is Worthington Dog Shuffle here in our taste testing kitchen with Seymour Emesis. Mr. Emesis is here to try some of our new delicious taco sauce in a totally unrehearsed and unscripted commercial. Please step over here Mr. Emesis, and try one of these tacos topped with our delicious new taco sauce. Yes folks, our new taco sauce is guaranteed not to contain any culturally appropriating ingredients. Well Mr. Emesis, what do you think?
It tastes like watered-down tomato paste.
It's awesome, isn't it? Now just flip that card over and read the name of our new taco sauce.
Well, I think that you at least picked a good name for it. It's called Blase Taco Sauce.
No, Mr. Emesis, it's called Blaze, rhymes with face or nutcase, not blase. There's no accent on the E.
There's no accent on flavor either. Are you calling me a nutcase?
Will someone cut his mic? Yes, folks, you too will love its flavor, and it's made right here in Stewport City.
Stewport City?
This non-commercial was brought to you by The Strange Express. Subscribe to our channel and get on board for a quick trip to the weird and wonderful.
The young prince arrived back home about the same time as his older brothers. They had returned with their carriages loaded with small dogs, yapping and barking so much that the royal estate sounded like a kennel. The king, disliking all of the commotion, immediately set to judging the animals. He held the walnut shell in his hand and surveyed all of the yapping dogs that the two older princes had brought. It was evident just by looking that even the smallest of them wouldn't fit comfortably in a small pumpkin shell, much less the walnut shell that the king held in his hand. Disappointed, the king turned to his youngest son and said,
"Did you not even bring one dog?"
The young prince smiled as he withdrew the hazelnut from his pocket and handed it to his father. He started to say nuts to you, Dad, but decided against it, and instead told his father to crack open the hazelnut carefully. The old king carefully cracked open the hazelnut, and once it was open, a beautiful small dog climbed out, no bigger than a fly, and gave the old king a friendly bark and began licking his fingers. The old king knew immediately that the dog presented by his youngest son was the only one that was small enough to fit in the walnut shell comfortably. The old king congratulated his youngest son for fulfilling the second quest, and then he placed the tiny dog into a special dog palace that he had especially made for the winning dog. The king then turned his attention to his older sons and presented them with participation certificates, and tasked them with finding good homes for the dogs which they had brought. A month later, the two older brothers returned, having placed all the dogs in good homes. The king called his sons together and said that since all three of them had attempted the first two tasks, that they were all still in the running to become the new king. But the youngest prince was ahead on points. The final quest would determine the winner and future king. The king announced that for the final task that the three princes had to find wives, and the prince who found the most beautiful wife and brought her home would be the new king. The two older sons were very excited, as this was quite the easiest quest that their father had issued. They were certain that they could find at least one attractive woman that would consent to marriage if she knew that she could potentially become the queen of the vast kingdom. The youngest prince, though, was not so enthused. While he never would have been able to complete the prior quests without the toad's help, he doubted that the toad would be able to give him any assistance with this new challenge. Nevertheless, he made up his mind that he would once again visit the amphibian. Toady may not be able to help him with the quest, but he knew that he always felt better when he shared his troubles with his friend, Toady, because her cheerfulness was contagious. Once again, the three brothers started on their way, and when they came to the crossroads, the young prince without hesitancy at once traveled down the dark and foreboding footpath. His older brothers paused, and discussed whether they should give the dark and foreboding footpath a try too. Realizing that they would have to leave their carriages and walk, as the path was too narrow for their supersized royal carriages to get through, they decided to stick to the wide roads. Besides, they thought, what kind of bride could anyone find down that desolate little path? As the youngest prince continued down the footpath alone, he noticed that it no longer seemed quite as dismal as he remembered. When he finally arrived at the bridge, he walked down to the edge of the stream, looking for a place to sit. Then, dismissing that thought, he looked around and began to imagine a small simple cottage built over in the woods across the way where he might live. As he stood there at the edge of the stream daydreaming, he was startled to hear a voice speaking to him.
"What's up, Buttercup?"
Turning around, he saw his friend, Toady, crawling toward him. Again, keeping the floral vein, he responded,
"Hiya, Synth."
He heard Toady chuckle at his response and answer,
"So what's up, Chuck?"
The prince, ignoring her sick pun, looked at the toad, sitting near his feet, squatted down and said,
"Oh, Toady, my father has issued the final quest, and I'm afraid that it is even beyond your power to help. I am to bring home a bride that is the most beautiful, The problem is, I have clear ideas on what I desire in a wife. For example, I once saw, in a distant kingdom, the most beautiful lady that I have ever seen. I still remember how she was sitting there in front of a window, brushing her long hair, when suddenly this old witch zapped her and she was gone.
The prince paused for a moment, and the toad asked him,
Is that who you want for your bride, the lady you saw in that window?
Well, maybe.
The young prince answered,
But since then, I have thought about it, and she may have been a very vain person, sitting around primping all of the time, brushing her hair, you know the type. If she had a personality like you, she would be perfect, cheerful, and friendly, seeing opportunities instead of problems. With a partner like that, I know that I could be a good king, and she would help me to make the best decisions.
The young prince saw what appeared to be a tear in the eye of the toad.
Sorry about that.
The prince started.
I tend to get a bit worked up.
That's okay.
The toad responded,
I understand, and I believe I can help you. You go back home and I will follow you shortly.
Before the prince could answer, the toad, showing more energy than she ever shown previously, leapt back into the swamp and disappeared. The prince stood up and he began to make his way back home, also with tears in his eyes, trying to imagine how the toad could possibly help him in his current dilemma. As he made his way back down the footpath, he heard the sound coming from behind him and turned to see what it was. To his surprise, he saw a carriage that appeared to be made of cardboard, drawn by rats coming toward him. The coachman, a fat mouse, sat on the box on the front of the coach, and two frogs serving as footmen marched behind the coach. Inside the coach sat his friend, Toady, and as the coach passed him, she blew him a kiss. Near the entrance of the footpath there was a curve in the path where it went around a large tree, and the young prince watched as the tiny carriage disappeared from sight as it rounded that curve. When it reappeared on the other side, it was no longer a tiny cardboard carriage pulled by rats, but it was a full-size carriage, drawn by horses, and when he looked inside the carriage, he saw the beautiful lady that he had fallen in love with when he saw her brushing her hair through the window. The beautiful lady was now calling for him to get in the carriage, and he recognized the kind, sweet voice of his friend, Toady. He immediately got into the carriage and sat beside her, and they rode back to the capital of his father's kingdom where his brothers and their prospective brides were waiting. The old king had the entire kingdom assemble the next day for a day of celebration. The old king asked each of his sons questions about their prospective brides. The two older sons barely knew the women that they had brought to become their wives, as they had only known them for a few weeks, but when he spoke to his youngest son, he told his father how he had fallen in love with her many months ago when he saw her in the window at the old witch's house, and how he had miraculously found her again living in the dismal swamp. He explained that she was the one that provided him with the linen and also the tiny dog, and that her beauty was far more than skin deep. His father was so impressed with his youngest son's story and the beauty of his chosen bride that he embraced both of them and declared that his youngest son and his bride would be the new king and queen of the land. They were married, and the new king and his queen Garlic reigned for a long, long time, and the entire kingdom was happy and prosperous under their reign. There were some, of course, who wondered how the king was able to bear his queen's odd food fetish, but I can assure you that it never bothered King Onion at all.
With that, we come to the close of another episode of The Strange Express. Once again, I want to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. As always, happy rails to you.